actually verify the PIN or verify the biometric information. Subsequently, in the EMV handshake, this card is going to generate a cryptogram that signs actually the transaction data that it has received via NFC from the terminal. And so we reuse completely the EMV handshake at the point of sale and reuse the capabilities of EMV to verify locally the user and generate a cryptogram that signs at least the amount today the receipt from the terminal. And so through the EMV handshake and through NFC, the terminal transmits information and the card will respond back with the user credentials, in particular the PAN and its expiry date, and in particular with this cryptogram. And all this is exactly the same as what is done today. Where things start differing is in the way the terminal communicates. Instead of communicating over a domestic network as we know them today, in our proposition, the terminal communicates to an entity, and I will come back to that afterwards as part of the clarification points. Let's say that this entity has, at a minimum, got to be a PISP, because in our proposition, this entity connects to the customer bank through the open APIs. And so in that respect, it needs to be a regulated PISP, duly declared, in possession of an EIDAS certificate, and so on. And so the terminal connects to this entity, and provides all the information required to this entity. So it will provide the PAN, the transaction information, the cryptogram generated by the card, and so on. At this stage, we call this entity a PISP for simplification. So this PISP is going to actually identify the bank of the customer through the issuer identification number of the PAN. We are proposing to reuse the ISO-defined structure of a PAN, and the first 6 digits of a PAN identify the bank. And so the PISP can identify the bank. In this proposition, the PISP serves the merchant. And so it knows the merchant very well. It has a contract with the merchant, and therefore it knows the IBAN of the merchant. And so the PISP will complete this payload with the customer data and the merchant data and the transaction data, and push a payment initiation request in its role of PISP through the open APIs to the customer bank. The customer bank has a conversion platform which serves 2 main purposes. The first purpose is to verify the cryptogram. So this conversion platform, as we will see just afterwards, is involved in the personalization of the card or the digital. And so this conversion platform holds the keys that have been personalized in the digital. And it is capable of verifying the cryptogram. This cryptogram verification actually serves the purpose of strong customer authentication, and I'll explain why just afterwards as well. And so the conversion platform verifies the cryptogram and thereby authenticates the user. Subsequently, it will convert the PAN back to the payer IBAN, to the IBAN of the customer. And based on that, the customer bank is now able to initiate an account-to-account instant payment. So that's the principle. Why is strong customer authentication performed in this way? As I said, the cryptogram is calculated by the card or the digital card in the mobile phone, thanks to bank keys that have been provisioned. The keys, in other words, represent the possession of the device. And so the cryptogram verification, a positive verification, proves that the user has the proper device. It proves the possession factor. In EMV, the cryptogram can actually sign the result of the local user verification that happened at the beginning. So when the user enters a PIN or presents a fingerprint or takes a selfie, the local verification of this is actually handled by the card, and that result is encrypted. It's part of the cryptogram. When the customer bank verifies the cryptogram, it also has proof that the local user verification was positively performed. In other words, in a single step, the cryptogram verification serves the purpose of strong customer authentication as defined by the RTS and the PSD2. And so what is important to highlight here is that, as you can see, there was no additional step redirecting the user to a bank user interface for the purpose of strong customer authentication. It is actually, the authentication is embedded in the payment process, and we'll come back to this vocabulary afterwards. The other aspect to highlight in this proposition is this notion of PAN being the proxy of an IBAN. As a matter of fact, PAN of debit cards today are already the proxy of an IBAN, but that's another subject. Here we're just reinforcing this aspect in the fact that for instant payments, the customer IBAN is the source of the payment. And to digitize this in a card or a mobile phone, we propose to reuse the PAN. And so the conversion platform serves this purpose during the personalization step of the card or the over-the-air provisioning step of the digital card in the mobile phone. And for this or the other, we reuse existing solutions of the industry, be it personalization bureaus or over-the-air provisioning systems for digital cards. When paying, as I said, the conversion platform receives the payload, verifies the cryptogram, and subsequently converts the PAN back to the bank. And so what's interesting here as well is that, as you may know, there are lots of discussions around this IBAN Proxy. There is even an initiative at the European level called SEPA Proxy Lookup, which proposes to use the telephone number as the proxy of the IBAN, and why not? In our solution, we propose to make the PAN the proxy of the IBAN. Importantly, in this solution, the IBAN is never shared outside of the bank. The PAN is shared, not the IBAN. So from an advantage perspective, it's very clear that it's exactly the same user convenience as today. I think nobody disagrees with the fact that it's not cumbersome to pay today. You can always go a step beyond. We've had remarks actually in that sense from a merchant that said we want to introduce very innovative ways of paying through instant payments where you don't go to the till anymore and you pay on the spot. You scan your products with your mobile phone and you pay on the spot. So, and yes, why not? Of course. But in the meantime, it is interesting to introduce instant payments in a way with which people are relatively happy and quite accustomed to. As I said, there's no redirection to the bank for authentication purposes, which makes it a very streamlined way of paying. And of course, it's not just plastic cards, it's mobile phones as well. Digitizing cards in phones is very well known today. Why not reuse this possibility? And importantly, as again, a differentiator of this solution versus QR code-based solutions is that there is no need for over-the-air connectivity of that mobile phone in the store. The mobile phone only needs to connect via NFC to the terminal, and that's it. Another advantage from a merchant perspective is the reuse of the existing POS infrastructure. In other words, this proposition allows a merchant to introduce a new way of paying through instant payments without having to deploy new hardware. There is, of course, a prerequisite, which is that the owner of the terminal allows this reuse. Okay? Terminals tend to be owned either by the merchant itself or by the acquiring bank or the merchant bank of this merchant. And so if that's the case, there would have to be an agreement to install new software in this terminal. Because indeed, this solution requires new software. As I explained, it performs in a very similar way in the card interaction, but it communicates differently. And so there needs to be a new application that will be downloaded into these terminals. These new applications will make use of an EMV kernel, and it will most probably not be an existing kernel of the existing schemes. It will have to be a new kernel. And the good news is that the industry has a number of readily available EMV white label kernels for this purpose. This terminal needs to connect to the PISP as we saw, and for this it can very well actually use existing protocols, ISO 8583, either ISO 20022 and so on, the Nexo, which can perfectly be used to transport the necessary information for the solution to work. Now this becomes also interesting. One of the goals of the European Commission in pushing for a pan-European scheme is to have global reach. As a matter of fact, smartphones do not offer a global reach. Not everybody has a smartphone, or at least an adequate smartphone. And in particular, some people do not want to use a smartphone today. They don't trust their smartphone or for whatever reason. And so there is a requirement to have a global reach, to have a device that is accepted by everybody. We believe that smart cards are very well trusted devices that serves the purpose very well. So the solution, again, if deployed, will address users of smartphones and users who do not want to use a smartphone. Introducing a new way of paying, well, it's not going to happen overnight, let's put it that way. And so there will be a phase-in of the new way of paying. The advantage of using cards or digital cards is that they can coexist with the existing ways of paying. We have here two examples, using the plastic card in this case, where the solution lends itself to co-badging an instant payment European application with an existing application of an international scheme, in which case you could imagine that if you travel outside of Europe, you'll use the international scheme part of the card, and if you pay within Europe, you'll use the instant payment scheme for that purpose. Or similarly, it can be co-badged with a domestic scheme application, in which case, within the country, you may use the domestic scheme or perhaps instant payments. So you can really mix things and really introduce gradually through this technology instant payments without very much customer disruption. As I said, EMV in this solution is more a means of identification and authentication. This means of authentication can be perfectly put to use for remote payments as well. Our paper does not describe that, but why not? And we have already examples of digital cards used to pay online. It already exists, and so we can perfectly imagine that this solution can be used for remote payments, whether in an out-of-band situation, if you're shopping on a PC and you are redirected to your mobile phone to approve and authenticate on the phone, or in an app-to-app where you switch from the merchant app to the banking app for that purpose. In this case, the EMV cryptogram has to sign the transaction amount and the merchant ID in order to meet the dynamic linking requirement. And this is perfectly possible, of course. As I said, this solution, as we propose it, makes use of the open APIs. There is an impact on the open APIs because, as we saw, the PISP sends to the bank authentication data, to put it that way. So there is the payer PAN, there is EMV data, there is an EMV crypto. And at this stage, the existing API standards do not describe this information. And so there will be an impact. Now, it will depend on which API standard we're looking at. I mentioned the fact that authentication was embedded in the payment act, the act of paying. Actually, the open APIs have already defined an embedded authentication model. And this is when the authentication data is sent through the open APIs. And so the Berlin Group, or STET in France, for example, have defined an embedded model. It tends to make use of passwords and OTPs, so it's a bit different. But we started working, particularly with the Berlin Group, there's a stakeholder working group that works on the subject of embedded authentication. And so we believe the open APIs can perfectly be used to transport this data, provided there will be some modifications. So I've now finished with the clarification, with the overview of the principles of the instant payment card. And as I said, we got some questions and comments after the publication of the paper. And so let's look at them, some of them now. So we were asked, actually, so who is the POSB? So in this drawing here, tries to clarify something. The entity in the middle of this drawing is not just a POSB. It is a merchant service provider. It has to be a POSB in order to connect to the open APIs, but it is actually more globally a merchant service provider. Who is this? Well, it depends. It can be a merchant processor, the one currently serving the merchant. It can be a payment gateway of some kind. It can be the merchant itself. Large merchants may be interested in taking on this role. It can be the merchant bank, the acquiring bank of today that could decide to take on this role. Or it could be a fintech of some kind there's already a POSB for other solutions and that would like to extend its services to this kind of solution. And so you see, this is, I think this is where we were trying to get at with the proposition, is to make it an open proposition where different actors can actually play in line with the spirit of PSD2. Another question we got, which is a good one actually, because coming back here, this entity, the merchant service provider, does not need to have a relationship with the payment user. There's no need for that. There's no requirement for this POSB, merchant service provider, to have a relationship with the user. It serves the merchant. And so under PSD2, the POSB communicates to the customer bank based on the user consent. And so how is user consent provided to the POSB when this POSB has no knowledge of this user? It doesn't have a relationship with it at all. And so this is our view within SPA. The terminal application that's actually managing the user interface to the user at the point of sale is a POSB terminal application. And so the display, what is displayed on the screen of the terminal represents the user interface of the POSB. At this stage, the user has a choice. He does not agree with the amount and he walks away and he doesn't pay. So he has not provided consent. Or he agrees with the amount. Of course, he agrees with the merchant because we're in a face-to-face situation. So he knows where he is, right? So if he agrees to the amount, he will pay. He will tap the card, he'll insert the card, he'll tap his mobile phone. He'll present his PIN, his fingerprint. So the act of paying, in our view, represents the consent provided by the payment service user to the POSB. Now, this is the SPA view. When you look at PSD2, PSD2 says consent should be agreed upon, the method of consent should be agreed upon between the parties. And very clearly, for this solution, like any other, there will have to be agreements in place. For example, there will have to be an agreement between the bank of the customer and the customer, perhaps through the general terms and conditions of use of the card. That would be a perfect way of getting the customer to agree to this method of providing consent. And more generally, we'll come back to this notion, there will most certainly be a scheme agreement that binds the parties that want to play in this. And so that would include the banks and it would include the POSBs. So we believe the method of providing consent makes sense, but it will certainly have to be reflected in agreements. Another question we got is, so should all the banks invest in this conversion platform? And so maybe, but not necessarily. If you make a comparison, this conversion platform sits in the same space as the authorization service that are currently used to process today's card-based payments. There are authorizations, as you all know, and therefore the purpose of authorization, there is an authorization server. Here, there is something a little bit similar, which we call very generically a conversion platform. This can be hosted and insourced by the bank, but it can also be outsourced. Why not? As authorization hosts are today outsourced also. It could be outsourced to a third party that's common to multiple banks. It could be even an identity provided in a federated identity system, for example. It could be also delegated to the PISP that could provide this service on behalf of the banks. So there are multiple possibilities, and actually this goes beyond the scope of SPA. What is for sure, however, is that if it's outsourced or delegated, there will here again have to be an agreement between the bank and the party with whom it is liaising for the purpose of handling this conversion platform. So we get this question all the time. What is the business model? I mean, you're asking the bank to issue a new card when banks issue cards today that do the job perfectly well. Why should they do this? Good question. What is the business model? And so, but we're not going to answer the question, actually. The question is an extremely valid question, but it's not a question linked to the proposition. It's not a question linked to the use of a card or a digital card to initiate an instant payment. The question is linked to the introduction of instant payments in Europe, possibly in a pan-European payment scheme, irrespective of the method of initiation. And it's not the only one. So of course there's the business model, because suddenly with instant payments, there's no payment guarantee, so the interchange structure differs radically. So the business model has to be reinvented, but it's not linked to the payment initiation method. It's linked to the introduction of instant payments. And the same goes for the rules, the governance of such a system, maybe the certification of the devices, and so on and so forth, the brand, the acceptance mark, and so on. So there are so many other questions that need to be answered, including the business model. So we're not answering the question. It's not in our scope. It is a question to answer. We view that question as quite distinct from the method actually used to initiate the instant payment. As I said, in the there is an alternative to the open banking route, which is this one. And we know, as a matter of fact, that it's being considered. This method serves exactly the same purpose. It's to initiate an instant payment at the point of sale using a card or a digital card and using EMV for that purpose. Where it differs radically is in the method for that terminal to reach the customer bank. This method reuses domestic networks and that need, if, for example, the customer is from another country and is traveling to and paying at a merchant in a distinct country, then there will have to be some interconnectivity of domestic networks. And these domestic networks will, like they do today, route authorization requests, which are no longer authorization requests per se, but they'll be reusing those protocols in order to reach the customer bank. There will be a cryptogram verification in a very similar manner, except that it will be handled by the authorization host. And then subsequently, there will be a difference because there will not be anymore the existing clearing and settlement mechanisms as we know them today. It will be an instant payment. So this is another way to initiate at the point of sale using a card to initiate an instant payment. It uses different rails, and why not? SPA is quite agnostic to the approach. We have a view that cards can actually provide a number of benefits in terms of user experience, both to users and merchants. And this other alternative method serves this purpose extremely well as well. So no problem at all. The approaches differ on the parties involved. In the proposition we made, it is using open banking, the open APIs, and as we saw, it's opening up the market to new actors. And I explain why we position the paper that way and not the other one. The other one makes use of the existing networks and therefore the existing and incumbent actors. And one of the benefits of that approach is there is more reuse of the infrastructure. And so this drives us to why did we publish the paper using the open banking route? And the reason for that is we've heard quite consistently that cards are for cards as we know them today. Open banking is different. Open banking is not for cards. Cards is the other stuff. Then there is open banking, and open banking is obviously for more innovative, modern stuff. What we wanted to demonstrate through the paper is that cards can be perfectly put to use within an open banking framework, using modern ways and instant payments and all that kind of stuff, and they're absolutely not a solution of the past. They may be very well a solution for the future. And moreover, they lend themselves to a transition from the ways of paying of today to these modern ways of paying tomorrow. And that's what we wanted to demonstrate through the use of the solution we defined in the paper. To finish, as you may know, the European Commission released a consultation on a retail payment strategy for the EU. Very recently. Actually, it's still open. I think the submissions have maybe just closed. SPA made a submission, by the way. When you look at the objectives defined in this document, they're listed here as they are written. We believe the SPA proposition, as described in the paper, ticks all the boxes. The first objective is to offer fast, convenient, safe, affordable, transparent payment instruments with a pan-European reach, and the same as domestic customer experience. The SPA proposition ticks all of this. Innovative, competitive, contestable, meaning open up to new players. The SPA proposition, as described in the paper, ticks this box. Access to safe, efficient, and interoperable retail payment systems and other support infrastructures. Yes, the card lends itself to run on a new infrastructure as well as the existing ones. Improve cross-border payments, including remittance, facilitating the international role of the euro. Yes, the card lends itself to growth beyond the European Union of this means of payment, beyond, cards is, one of the benefits of the cards and the associated terminals is that they're accepted everywhere today. So you have an existing infrastructure and existing habits that can be leveraged for a pan-European payment system to be used outside of Europe as well. So that concludes the presentation. But let me see if we have questions. I'll go to the beginning. So we have a question from a merchant point of view. Is it still a card transaction or an SCE? So this is a good question because it is an SCT, instant transaction. And in that respect, so maybe it's not so much for the merchant, it's for the customer that there is education perhaps that will need doing. Today, when you pay with your card, you know that you will be debited if it's a credit card later, if it's a debit card the next day or in a couple of days. The instant payment card, you're debited in seconds. So in seconds, your account is debited. It's a big change. But the change is quite beneficial for the merchant. I don't see them complaining at all about that. From the customer perspective, especially imagine this card is co-badged with a scheme as we know them today and instant payments. when they pay with the scheme, they'll be debited in a few days, or maybe even later, maybe at the end of the month, for example. If it's instant payment, it's in the next second, so it's gone. So there is a difference here for the consumer that may require some consumer education. So from a merchant point of view, it's a card that triggers an instant payment. From the consumer perspective that has no clue about these differences, the difference is debited in the next second or debited later. Another question is, will the payer be able to choose at the point? This is so this is kind of in line with what I just said. If the card is multiple application, yes, there will most certainly have to be a choice. There is already a regulation in that sense. So this is a kind of sensitive subject because the regulation today, the IFR regulation, says the customer has the final say. If the card is multi-application, it supports, for example, an international and a domestic scheme, normally the customer has the final say per the IFR regulation. In practice, it tends to be the merchant that chooses it, right? But here, it is indeed, because of the difference in behavior, you know, payment in the next second or payment later in the month, perhaps indeed, the payer will have to have a say more than it does today. That will typically be where a scheme has to provide some rules. And actually, so that was the only two questions. Are there other questions? Let me check in the chat box. Are there any other questions? See if there's more in the Q&A section. Yes, I have other questions in the Q&A section. Could a non-bank issuer participate in this model? I would say, generally speaking, this model applies to ASPSPs as defined under PSD2. So an account servicing payment service provider. If that's a non-bank, then there still have to be an ASPSP. So there'll still have to be a regulated entity. So not sure if this is answering correctly the question, but it'll have to be a financial institution of some kind. There's another question. In a first approach, would instant payment smart cards require specific hardware upgrades? So I think I answered the question, not hardware upgrades, provided the terminal is already EMV enabled and perhaps contactless enabled. If that is the case, it will require a software upgrade, but not a hardware upgrade. How does the consumer know it is an SCT? So same question. How does the customer know it's an SCT or a card payment? So here, the question I hinted at, which is the mark, the brand of this future European scheme, is an extremely important aspect because it builds trust, but it also builds, it provides some knowledge to the consumer on the behavior of the payment instrument. Okay. And so he must know, this consumer, that if he pays using the logo of this instant payment, he will know that it's an instant payment. So that would be the way. So the brand, the mark, is extremely important in this to answer this question. And for the customer education, it's extremely important that the mark clearly identifies to the consumer that if he pays with that application, his account will be debited in the next second. Legal rules. See the question altogether. Legal rules between SCT and cards are different. Cards as we know them today, absolutely, absolutely. Which is why new rules have to be defined for instant payment. Today, with cards, you can dispute a payment and get a chargeback. With instant payments, principle is there is no. I mean, that's why there's strong customer verification. There's no chargeback, and the dispute will have to be handled through new rules. So indeed, instant payments, but again, this is quite, it's irrespective of the method to initiate the instant payment, but there will be new rules for instant payments, absolutely. How will reversals and, so this actually is a very linked question. How will reversals and refunds be processed? Well, by means of the rules and methods defined by the future scheme. And again, this is irrespective of the initiation method. If the initiation method is using a QR code or scanned by a mobile phone, you will have exactly the same question. How will reversals and refunds be processed? It's not a question linked to the instant payment card. It's a question linked to the use of instant payments. And so, yes, there will have to be answers to those questions, but that's not in the SPA scope. Who do you see driving the implementation of this? Does it need a scheme to address the key questions you raised? Yes, such as the economic model rules and so on. So yes, I believe very much so. I don't think so. The proposal we're making is, it would be difficult for an individual bank to adopt this all alone. Why not? Why not? But at the end of the day, the proposition fits the implementation for a pan-European scheme. And there should be, so as we all know, there'll probably be an announcement of EPI tomorrow. And maybe there will be a scheme coming out of this initiative. That scheme, if they're interested in this model, would be the one that addresses the key questions, absolutely. So pre-authorization, so question, so how do you see the pre-authorization management? Again, this is a question that has been raised in multiple forums, including forums that work on QR code initiated payments, mobile SCT, as they're called. And so, yes, there is a question on pre-authorization. No, it's not linked to the use of an instant payment card or a QR code. It is a question linked to, again, instant payments. And there are already discussions and answers that are addressing pre-authorization, or, for example, as another aspect, when you pay with a final amount unknown, for example, at the pump, the gas station, when you pay and you don't know how much you're going to pay in the end. And so there are already questions like that that have been raised and that have gotten some answers. Okay, so I'm not sure I'm the expert to talk about the answers, but there are answers around pre-authorizations and approving an unknown amount. And typically, that's you approve the maximum amount. So there are already some dispositions in the text, including in the RTS or in the EBA opinions that address this kind of question. We have another question on reversal and refunds that I think I addressed. Could a non-bank issuer participate? So it's again the same question, so it was repeated in the other chat box. Would the new scheme have to define all the rules, example disputes? Yes, I believe so. Another question on reversal and refunds. Will this work for a card that only supports online PIN? Yes, why not? But the PIN would have to be verified by what we call the conversion platform. So the answer is yes. The PIN will have to be verified by the conversion platform. So, and it will have to be conveyed via the open APIs. The PIN will have to be conveyed by the open APIs. By the way, as I said, the existing embedded model of the open APIs already support transmission of password and OTP. That's already supported. The password PIN or an online PIN, it's a bit the same, right? So yes, it would be possible to use an online PIN verified by the server, in this case, the what we call the conversion platform. Today's issuers earn money with interchange. Will this, so again, the business model will have to radically change because today there is indeed an interchange structure, an interchange fee. And as you know, the interchange fee is very much linked to the guarantee of payment by the issuer. If there is no need for guaranteed payments because it's an instant payment It's push technology. It can't be disputed and so on. Suddenly, the interchange fee structure as we know it today has to change. So yes, there will necessarily have to be a change. Will there still be an interchange? I don't know. For sure, the customer bank in this model has to find a way of being retributed for issuing a card and processing the instant payment. It's a must-have for sure. It's not in the scope of SPA. We are not legitimate to answer the question. In case of co-branding, how is the choice done by the consumer? So we had that question already. It is a very good question because the consumer has to be educated on the major difference between today's cards and this future instant card. And that would probably be done by means, if it's on the mobile phone, perhaps on the mobile phone itself, at least on the terminal, as is normally defined under the IFR regulation today. What is the benefit for the customer? We didn't address that. That's a good question, because the main beneficiary of this solution is the merchant, because it gets instantly paid, no charge back, cash in the account immediately, and so on and so forth. So there's, and by the way, another benefit for the merchant is the higher payments enabled by SCT Inst. Okay, today the limit is 15,000. It will go up, and so cars tend to have a floor limit, and so here you could buy your car using instant payments. So well, so there are benefits for the merchants. From the consumer perspective, there's hardly any benefit at all. It's if you ask the customer, he doesn't care. He pays, wants to pay. He wants to pay efficiently, and it doesn't cost him to pay. You know, that's the view of the customer, and it's got to be simple. You know, it shouldn't be a headache to pay. So I think the benefit for the consumer, from the perspective of comparing this method with future measures based on QR code, where you redirect to a bank UI and you have to do this and that and the other, the benefit is the fluidity and the natural way of doing things, you know, as they do them today. That would be the benefit, but it's not a benefit versus today. So versus today, there's no benefit. If this is a kind of, if this is driven by Europe, let's call it that way, that wants to move to instant payments. That's the only driver from the consumer perspective. Otherwise, he doesn't care. Now, if tomorrow it's instant payments and the consumer has a choice of paying by QR code, with redirection and over-there connectivity, and you know, he's got to do multiple gestures before he finally pays, then you will find a benefit in using the instant payment card. That's for sure. Another question on interchange that we answered. What about notification to the merchant that IP has succeeded? This is a good question. And so it's not addressed in this presentation as we saw it today. In the paper, there is at the end an appendix that shows a very simplified flow diagram. And indeed, the notification to the merchant, what we propose is that, so through the open APIs, the bank, the ASPSP, can notify the PISP. So that's already supported in the open APIs. The bank, the ASPSP, can notify of the success the PISP through the open APIs. Now, how does the PISP notify the merchant? Well, we propose to use existing protocols, namely the authorization response, which serves that purpose. It notifies the merchant. And the way the merchant is actually notified is through the display on the terminal that the transaction succeeded. So we really make reuse today of the existing methods for that purpose. So yes, and from the side question, the notification to the consumer could be handled in two ways. It could be as simple as printing out a ticket. That's the way of notifying the customer today. Or it could be the message displayed on the terminal, which is a method of today. It could also be a notification over the air, if there is over the air connectivity, directly from the bank of the customer through an SMS or a push notification to his mobile app. So there could be a notification to the consumer over the air or via the terminal. But to the merchant, it would be via the terminal. What is the benefit for the customer with respect to the existing solutions? I think I tried to answer that question already. How would contactless transactions work where they don't come online for authorization? They'd have to go online. This is instant payment. Instant payment is online. If there is no online, there's no instant payment. So it's a necessity. This solution works where there is online connectivity of the terminal to the bank, or to the POSB at least. If that connectivity is not available, it is not possible to do an instant payment. In which case, perhaps, for example, if there was a multi-usage card, then the merchant would say, well, it didn't go through an instant payment, but perhaps you can use now your other application on your card to pay. And if that card supports offline authorization, then it would go, it would be accepted offline. Will remote transactions work using physical card similar to existing cards online? That's the idea. Yes, exactly. That's exactly that. So yes, the answer is yes. The consumer wants to pay less. So I'm not sure to understand the question. Consumers today, they don't visibly pay a fee when they pay. Let's say it's built in the price of the product. So they don't have a fee when they pay. They have a yearly charge for their card that they have today, and maybe they will continue to have that tomorrow. I don't know. Again, this is beyond the scope of SPA. So perhaps consumers want to pay less. The introduction of this new means of payment, that's clearly a bank choice. I don't know how to answer. Banks will never accept to lose the interchange fee. That is quite possible. But in that case, they will not adopt instant payments in Europe. They'll continue to use what they're using today. Instant payments introduces necessarily changes in the interchange fee. So the answer to that question is, if banks do not want to lose the interchange fee, then they will not adopt instant payments, at least as a mass way of paying across Europe in the future European scheme. How can we use the current infrastructure for digital card transactions without, for example, MasterCard MDES? So an interesting question. So MDES indeed is the digitization service of MasterCard, or VTS for Visa. And other domestic schemes have their own digitization service, by the way. And so here, the answer is there is no need in this future way of paying to use MDES or VTS or an existing digitization service of a domestic scheme, because it would be a different scheme, a different solution. At the heart of that, there is that, what we call generically, conversion platform. It serves the same purpose as the MDES platform or the VTS platform. And it would actually reuse very similar technology, very similar technology. They know the merchant pays a fee. Certainly the merchant pays a fee today. Now, interestingly, tomorrow that will stay. The POSB will not serve the merchant for free. So from a business model perspective, it's not really in our scope here. We should be answering these questions. But in our view, the POSB, which is at the end of the day is a merchant service provider, will be charging a fee to the merchant. Seems pretty obvious, but again, not in our scope. The difficult question is, how does the customer bank be paid? How does he do? If you compare to payment online on internet, you need dynamic linking. So yes, under the RTS, when you pay online, you need dynamic linking. And so here, because we've had this question already with regards to EMV, the EMV standard allows dynamic linking, but the implementations in EMV kernels at point of sale only sign the transaction amount, not the merchant ID. But our view, we asked actually the EBA a question with regards to this. Our view is that when you pay in-store NFC in front of the customer, it's not a remote payment. And so our view is that dynamic linking is not required. However, if this solution, if the mobile wallet that makes use of EMV is to be used for remote payments, then dynamic linking is a must. And the EMV standard is perfectly capable of handling the signature of signing both transaction amount and payee ID, so the dynamic linking requirement. We almost run out of time, but there's only one question left. What is the real business problem solved compared to existing payment technology? Again, we're very embarrassed to answer questions with regards to business aspect because it's not our role. I would say, I don't want to answer the question. The premise, again, the starting point for our proposition is that there is a desire to move to instant payments in Europe and create a European payment scheme based on instant payments. If that starting point premise disappears, our idea disappears as well. It makes no point. So the answer to the question is really linked to the willingness or not of the community to move to instant payments in Europe. I think that was the last question, and we've actually almost run out of time. So thank you very much for attending. Please do reach out to SPA if you're interested in continuing the discussion. Actually, I think there is, voilà. So you can download the paper here, and we are reachable via the website or whichever. I mean, so please do reach out if you're interested in continuing the discussion. We will be glad to actually continue discussing this model. So thank you very much for attending, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Bye-bye.